Today we'll be looking at another PSLE maths question from 2012. Let me read out the question as follows. A bakery and a library are 120 meters apart. They are located between Hong's house and Jaya's house, as shown below. The bakery is exactly halfway between the two houses. One day, Hong and Jaya started cycling from their houses at the same time, and they arrived at the library together. Jaya cycled at 70 meters per minute, while Hong cycled at a speed 15 meters per minute faster than Jaya. How much further did Hong cycle than Jaya? And how far is Jaya's house from the library? So these are the two questions that we need to answer. For the first question, how much further did Hong cycle than Jaya? Let us look at the illustration below. So based on the question, we know that the bakery is exactly midway between Hong's house and Jaya's house. And the distance between the bakery and the library is 120 meters. So when Jaya and Hong both started cycling from their homes, they reached the library at the same time. So this is what it looks like. Right, to answer the question, we need to examine what would happen if Hong and Jaya cycled at the same speed. So if they both travel at the same speed, what would it look like based on the illustration on the screen? So assuming that Hong and Jaya cycle at the same speed, which is 70 meters per minute, the distance traveled by each of them would be the same because they're traveling at the same speed and traveled for the same amount of time. So that would mean that the distance traveled by Hong to the end point, this distance would be equal to the distance traveled by Jaya from her home to the library. So this distance would be equal to this distance, right? And because the bakery is exactly in the middle of Hong's and Jaya's house, that means the distance between Hong's house and the bakery is the same as the distance between the bakery and Jaya's house. And since this portion is equal to this portion, the distance between the endpoint and the bakery must be equal to the distance between the bakery and the library. Right? So this distance must be equal to this distance, which is 120 meters. So the question asks for the additional distance that was cycled by Hong would be represented by this portion here, which is between the endpoint and the library. So the additional distance cycled by Hong would be 120 plus 120, or 120 times 2, which is equals to 240 meters. So given the same amount of time at the same speed, Hong would travel from this point to this point, and Jaya would travel from this point to this point. So, but because Hong cycled faster, he covered additional distance, and the additional distance would be the distance between the endpoint and the library, which is 120 plus 120, which is 240. Next, we go to the second part of the question, which is how far is Jaya's house from the library? From the question, we know that Jaya's speed was 70 meters per minute, and Hong's speed was 15 meters per minute faster. So that's 70 plus 15, which is equals to 85 meters per minute. So the question is looking for Jaya's house from the library. So the distance between Jaya's house and the library, which is represented by these question marks. And that would be the same distance between Hong's house and the endpoint, assuming both travel at the same speeds. We'll try and solve this question first with algebra. So let x be the distance from Jaya's house to the library. So Jaya's house to the library is x, and because this distance will be equal to this distance, the distance from Hong's house to the library, from here to this point, will be equals to x plus 120 plus 120. And because we look at ratios of the speed of Hong and Jaya's cycling compared to the distance between Hong's house and the library and the distance from Jaya's house to the library. So the ratio of distance travelled by Hong from his house to the library divided by the distance from Jaya's house to the library will be equal to the ratio of Hong's cycling speed over Jaya's cycling speed. So from the question, we know that the distance from Hong's house to the library is equals to x plus 120 and 120. The distance from Jaya's house to the library is x. So it's x plus 240 divided by x. And the ratio on the right side is the speed, the ratio of their speeds, which is 85 meters per minute over 70 meters per minute. If you divide by 5 on the numerator and the denominator, you have 17 over 14. You do a cross multiplication and you solve for x, and the solution is 1120. So the distance between Jaya's house and the library is 1120 meters. We will also look at how to solve this part of the question using the block method. So once again, we look at the ratio of the distance between Hong's house to the library over the distance between Jaya's house to the library will be equal to the ratio of Hong's cycling speed over Jaya's cycling speed. So from this diagram, we know that the distance between Hong's house and the library is actually equal to the distance between Jaya's house and the library plus 120 plus 120. The reason is because this portion is equal to this portion, right? And the ratio on the right, the equation on the right side would be the Hong's speed over Jaya's speed, which is 85 over 70. Okay, so this would be when we fit in all the numbers, this is what we will get. Of course, we can divide the right side numerator and denominator by 5 each so that we get 17:14 ratio. Then we draw our block diagram, right? So we know distance from Jaya to library plus 240 over the distance from Jaya's house to the library is equals to 17:14. So this represented by the block diagram here, 17 parts to 14 parts. And the top blocks represent the distance from Jaya's house to the library plus 240, and the bottom blocks represent the distance from Jaya's house to the library alone. So you can see that 17 blocks minus 14 blocks, so the difference will be 3 blocks, and these 3 blocks will be equal to 240 meters. Right, so the distance from Jaya's house to the library, which would be equal to 14 blocks, is equals to 240 divided by 3 blocks multiplied by 14. That will give us 80 times 14, which is equals to 1120 meters. So this portion gives you the distance per block, and then 14 gives you the 14 blocks that represents the distance from Jaya's house to the library. So we have 1120 altogether. So both methods, be it algebra or the block method, will give you the same answer.